Morning came to the city like a fever that had not yet burned itself out, a slow, sticky heat that pried at shutters and made the harbor stink of tar and rotting weed. The gulls were at their work long before the bells sounded prime, wheeling in pale strokes over the masts and the red clay rooftops, shrieking at the fishwives and the boys clambering on nets. In the alley behind the street of flour, the bakers opened their ovens and laid out flat rounds and sugar twists, their breath little ghosts that vanished as quickly as they were made. Down the hill, where the smell of lemon oil drifted like a promise and where the cobbles had been freshly sanded to impress important eyes, the procession came. Gold and green banners, a rolling whisper of silk, the bright ring of harness. It would have been a lovely arrival for anyone who could afford to be only a girl. Those who could not kept their heads down and their hands busy. Tansy, the steward had called her when he wrote her down, as if the name were a broom to be leaned in a corner and forgotten until the next sweep. He did not look at her twice, only marked her height and the copper brown of her hair and the thinness of her wrists, and nodded as though she were a bolt of linen. From Bitterbridge, he said without asking, and she had ducked her head to make herself smaller, letting her cap slip so that stray wisps would hide the sharpness of her face. "Yes, my lord," she said, keeping the riverlands from her voice as best she could. "Tansy, my lord." The green tide rolled through the mud gate like a season returned to claim its due. Their rose pins winked in the sun. The scent of them trailed through the market like the promises of songs. Women leaned out of windows to see Marjorie of Highgarden pass in her litter with its gauze curtains and its pale blue cushions, and men stood on crates and barrels with boys in their arms so they would be able to say later that they had seen a girl the singers already loved. The Queen of Thorns rode in her open chair as if she owned the day itself, her eyes a sharper weapon than any knight wore at his hip. "Tansy?" breathed one of the other girls at Arya's shoulder, a plump girl from Ashford called Purra who had not learned to keep her chatter behind her teeth. "Do you see the old one? They say she speaks to lords the way we speak to cats." Arya had seen her. She kept her hands on the leather straps of the hamper she carried, lemons from the reach, oiled so they glowed like small suns, and made her face dull. She had been taught dullness in Harrenhal and at the inn with the peach trees. The absence of light in the eyes, the smallness of breath, the way a body can be made to vanish while still standing in a hall. She had learned 100 names for it. Mouse, wisp, the dust beneath a lord's boots, but the best was silence. "There is magic in silence," Syrio had told her. "It is a soft cloak that lets a knife think of its work." She walked in the shadow of the litter. The red keep climbed above them, not red at all, but sunburned and iron brown, its towers clutching the sky. She had known its bones once in another life, when she had had a father and a needlework that pained her fingers and a sister who called the world a prettier place than it turned out to be. In those days, she had been the loud one. "Arya, be still," they had said. The walls had listened to her then. They knew her feet. Their cracks and their hidden steps had told her their secrets the way old dogs tell fables with their eyes. Now she kept her gaze down and counted her breaths. At the gates up in the keep, the gold cloaks were more polished than Arya remembered. After Blackwater, everything that wanted to survive had learned polish. The Lannister lions flamed on shields like new coin. The paint on the Kingsguard's white shields had been freshened so bright it looked like milk. The men who bore them stood with backs stiff as pikes, their arrogance the kind that has been shored by victory. One face among them was a scab the city had not yet found a way to pick off. Ser Meryn Trant wore his white cloak as if it were a towel hung to dry. He had the solid meatiness of a man who does not think about the limits of flesh. He was not as tall as Ser Boros, not as broad as Ser Mandon had been before he grew cold on the Blackwater's green foaming. But there was a weight to him that made space around him buckle, the space of girls' cheeks, of soft mouths, of obedience. He stood in the shade thrown by the gatehouse's right tower, polishing his gauntlet with a square of cloth while Joffrey's banner rippled overhead. Arya did not look at him. Looking was a pulse, a promise. It roused targets, and she had no wish to wake him yet. She smelled the iron of his polish, though, and the tallow in the seams of his glove, and a whiff of sour breath when he said something low to a gold cloak at his shoulder and laughed. The laugh was a dull thing, a hammer striking tin. She let it pass through her like a wind through reeds. Inside the keep, the work was waiting. They put her in kitchens to begin with. New girls always went to kitchens, where they learned to burn their hands and were measured by how little noise they made about it. The cook was a woman with a neck like a ham and hands that could lift a cauldron with one arm. She spoke into a wooden spoon, as if the spoon could send her voice into the bones of a wall and make it stay there forever. "Tansy," she said, not looking up from the pot where onions were admitting they would be sweeter roasted. "You are to keep close at the pottage, and you, Purra, you will not snatch at the honey. I can tell the pot by the smell of it when a little thief has been near. Do you think bees do not count?" "Yes, cook," Purra murmured, pinched as a mouse. Arya cut bread. She cut until her wrists ached, until she could see each slice before she made it as clearly as if it were printed on the board. She learned where the knife bent and where it liked to fight and what the difference was between loaves that had been allowed to rise and loaves that had been bullied into shape because the day was short. She learned the names of men she did not wish to know by the kinds of meat they took without asking. A Myrish sellsword who had a scar like a hawk's foot across his cheek and a habit of warming his hands on girls' elbows. A giant of a northern man with a soiled cloak who looked at the soup as if he might drown in it with relief. Tommen's sworn sword, Ser Preston, who never met anyone's eyes and kept to those corners that defenders of innocence often find. By midday she knew who would linger in the passage behind the buttery to tell a vulgar joke, and who would use the straight corridor past the armory because he wanted to be seen. She knew which stair in Maegor's holdfast would creak if trod in the center and how to slide a foot down the side to make it quiet. Sirio's light had not gone out in her. It had only learned to hide. Sometimes when she turned with a tray balanced on her palm, she heard his voice in the slip of air that moved past her ear. "First you see, then you move, and last you are gone before their shadow has worked out what has changed." She made a practice of being present in rooms where news happened. She took a broom to the floor of the servants' hall and hummed to herself when the laundry women came in to lay their gossip out to dry with the linens. She scrubbed tables while the understewards counted cups and said in low voices who had drunk too much of which wine and put his hand where. She learned the color of Marjorie's newest gown, seafoam silk, lined with white so that it moved like a wave when she walked. By the way, the seamstress sucked her teeth and said they had cut too much of a fine bolt, and who was in attendance when the small council gathered by whose boots were in need of a polish at the same hour. At dusk she took jugs of watered beer up the steps to the outer yard where the squires were forever trying to be men and listened to the slap of practiced swords and the puff of boys' chests. When Ser Meryn came to watch, the air itself seemed to arrange itself in a thicker weave. The boys swung with more noise then. He liked noise. The list came to her at night when the lamps were doused and the dormitory's windows showed a square of sea-colored dark. It was not a thing she summoned. It came of its own as rain comes to roofs. Joffrey, she would think, and a little heat would tighten in her chest until she had to make her body breathe around it. Cersei, Island Pain, the hound, though she had looked him in the face and it had rearranged itself under the ashes of a fire she could not read.
Ser Meryn Trant.
The words arranged themselves like stones on a riverbed. She let the water move past them. She did not touch them. Sometimes she did not finish the list, and that was all right too. Sometimes she said only his name, and in the long dark it made the room smaller until she could feel the bones of her own hands like the bars of a cage she would one day open. She found Needle again with a dishcloth and a ladle. The kitchens had a dozen knives, but none that were hers. It had not occurred to the cook that a maid would need a skewer as thin as Arya requested. One made of a spring steel spit shaved down until it was the thickness of her small finger, with a point ground as fine as a whisper. "For capons," Arya said. "If the skin is tight with fat, the fat will crackle only if we pierce it. Cook." The woman studied her a long time with her spoon between her teeth as if the wood could tell her witchcraft from sense, then shrugged and told the smith to make what the girl asked. It came back to Arya wrapped in a cloth that had an old grease stain in the shape of a leaf. She took it out behind the smokehouse at midnight, when the coals were embers and the stars looked as if they had been taken down and polished, and she moved with it until it knew her and she knew it. It was longer than Needle had been, but not so long that she could not hide it down the side of her boot, and it loved to find seams. She thought she would call it Thorn, because a rose without one was only a story. In the second week, As the Tyrells settled their petals into the cracks of the court, Marjorie began her distributions. Bread and coins and bright smiles down on the cobbles outside the September of Baylor, song and width of gown, and a way of listening that made even women with hands raw from scrubbing look as if they had been admitted to some important place. The city took to her the way parched grass takes rain. The Queen Regent watched from a litter with the curtains half drawn, like a cat behind a curtain that is not thick enough to make her feel safe. The king came once with red leather gloves that matched nothing he wore, and a long crossbow that matched the way he looked at things. The king's guard arrayed themselves like a wall that had learned to walk. Ser Meryn was on the king's right. He had a new dent in his gorget that had been planished but not erased. A gold cloak brought the king a new bolt, and Joffrey took it with a small flourish, wanting to be seen. Arya stood with a tray of barley loaves near the bottom of the steps, her cap tight over her hair, her eyes very brown and very tired. When the king raised the crossbow to point it at the sky for show, the people cheered as if they were hearing a song about his father. The augurs said a rook landed on the September's roof at that moment, but Arya did not look up. Ser Meryn's left gauntlet squeaked when he closed his fist. That was useful. He had begun to favor his right foot since the Battle of the Blackwater. The weight of the plate was ever so slightly more on that side when he shifted to look down the stairs. Useful. The strap of his tasset on the left was fraying. You could see one place where the leather had been patched and not dyed. Useful. His eyes were little. Not useful at all, except to tell a girl that eyes could be small and still do harm, that the size of a thing had nothing to do with the size of the ruin it added to the world. She said his name to herself softly without moving her mouth and felt the way the syllables sat on her tongue. Meryn. It wanted to be spat. Syrio had taught her better than to spit when water is scarce. She swallowed. In the White Tower of the Kingsguard, where the oaken door had an iron ring big enough for a child to put both arms through, the day's watch rotated when the sun moved past the highest angle of the castle wall. Arya learned this on the third day by bringing a jug of wine too late and having it taken out of her hand by a boy who said, "You'll learn," without rancor. Ser Meryn took the second watch more often than not. He liked to be seen when the court had gathered back from its meals, when words were heavy with sauce and the wine had loosened them. He liked to be on his feet when girls with trays had to pass near. He liked to be in the hall between the small council room and the doors to the throne. On the fifth evening of her watching, Arya took a bucket and a cloth and washed a square of stone just beside the tall oaken doors, working at a stain that did not exist while men in good cloaks spoke of tariffs and an eastern wind and whether the new queen-to-be would prefer rosemary to hyssop in her bath. She felt the doors would breathe against her spine as men moved behind it. When it opened, the world on the other side was the same except that it pressed harder. Tywin Lannister walked out at its center, his hair the color of wheat left too long in the field, his expression all angles and sums. He did not look down. The other men did. Lord Varys did, with eyes like wells where a woman might drown if she were not careful. Peter Baelish did, weighing everything he saw as if the numbers could be made to line up in a way that would make coins breed. Pycelle did, his beard weaving as he leaned on his chain. Ser Meryn was the stone that did not move as they passed. He held himself still not because a knight learns stillness, but because he wished to be an obstacle the world arranged itself around. There was a boy with him in pale squire's colors, whose face had not decided whether to be handsome, but whose fear had already decided to be useful. The boy kept his gaze on the line where wall met floor and moved a half-step every time Ser Meryn shifted, as if flinching in advance. "Bring oil," Ser Meryn told the boy, and then, in an afterthought that made the back of Arya's neck prickle, "And tell the girl to bend her back when she scrubs. A straight back is for ladies." The boy bobbed and fled. Arya let her back be straight for 3 breaths, watched from the floor the way coin watches a hand. She bent it again. She thought of Sansa then without wanting to. She saw her sister's face at the top of the steps inside the throne room, round with a new kind of fat that was not meat, humiliation swelling, when the king called for a beating because it made him feel like a man. She had not been there to see it. She had heard of it in whispers thickened with honey to make the words easier to swallow. She saw it anyway. The mind can paint what the hands cannot reach. Paints from a palette of knowing. Ser Meryn's hand was always raised in that picture. It was raised now, briefly, to test the strap that had been patched and not dyed. The killing, when it came, would not be magic. It would not be the gods leaning down. Only a seam and a moment, a shift of weight. You can split a man to the soul through an opening no wider than a finger, Syrio had said, and Arya had believed him because he had not lied to her. The gods lie in the mouths of priests. The truth lies in where a man keeps his heart. She spent the next days mapping the open. There are kinds of openness. There is the openness of the yard at noon, all eyes, and the openness of a threshold where a man may pretend he is alone because he is between places. There is the openness of a hall when the king makes of it a theater, because the watching is about the king and not the players behind his hands. There is the openness that is simply outdoors, the sky a bowl turned upside down to trap everyone under it, and girls with jugs and bread and the old poor in a river around the steps. In each kind of open there are seams, the cracks in attention, the slackening after a laugh, the pause when a man shifts his weight because his back aches. She learned them the way other girls learned songs. She set them to a rhythm of breath when she scrubbed pots or carried coals, so that the tune played behind her eyes and she tapped it out with her thumb on the handle of thorn where it lay down her boot. It was not fear that kept her hands steady but its cousin caution, which had taken fear into itself and taught it to sit. The house of black and white had not had her yet, but she had had 100 small teachers since Winterfell. A butcher with a whetstone that never left his belt, a woman at an inn who could pack 6 eggs in a basket so that none would break even when a squire with more wine than blood in him jostled her, an old man who had taught her how to walk on the balls of her feet in a flooded cellar so she could feel where the stones were worn. All of them spoke now in some part of her when she took the steps 2 at a time up the back stairs to the great hall with a jug of watered wine in each hand. Her cap tight, her face nothing. The day chose itself. It was a day washed clean by a night rain. The stones all darkened so that the red keep looked for a little while like the thing its name promised. Wind off the sea tugged at banners until they cracked like whips, and the smell of the harbor came up the hill to slap the court in the face. It would keep men restless. It would make them wish for warmer rooms, for fires, for being done with whatever words they had to throw at one another so they could go where their hands wanted to go. That made edges soften. That made openings. Petition day had been called. The throne room door was a mouth swallowing the city and spitting it back more tired. The dais had been moved a half-pace forward at the Queen Regent's order because it threw the light differently on the boy who sat the throne, making him look taller if you did not look too closely. The courtiers had taken their places along the walls like candlesticks, the spaces between them mirrors for their pride. The King's Guard ranged themselves across the bottom step of the dais as if they were the only stairs that mattered. Ser Meryn took the far right. He had removed his gauntlets. It was a small thing. Men used their hands to intimidate as often as to cut, but it made the air around him shine with the possibility of skin. Arya watched from the foot of the hall where girls with jugs were posted, modestly invisible, the way chairs are invisible when you have already sat down. Joffrey complained of the quality of a petitioner's accent. Laughter went out from him like crumbs thrown to birds. Ser Meryn's eyes swept the hall while his mouth tried on what it would look like if it were not bored. "Bread?" whispered Purra behind Arya, pushing a tray into her hands because the Duchess from somewhere with lilacs in its name was faint and wanted something to clutch that was not her own unsteadiness. Arya tilted the tray, a half round of oat. A white loaf with flour scattered on its top like the first snow. She thought of the gods would at Winterfell the way you think of a thing as you pass a door you cannot afford to open. A man was dragged in with wrists bound, one of the Riverlord's men by the look of him, his beard wild as if it had been trying to grow enough to protect his chin. He had stolen a skin of wine and then a second, and when the second skin had been I. And his belly he had beaten a guard who mocked his boots. They made him kneel. He began to say justice in a way that sounded like justice but which the boy on the throne did not recognize. Joffrey leaned forward as if he were listening. "His tongue," he said, and smiled for the laughter again. Cersei's mouth did something that would have been mistaken for a smile by anyone who had not raised girls. Marjorie's mouth did something that would have been mistaken for prayer by anyone who had not grown up listening to women who prayed because there was nothing else they could do. The Queen of Thorns did not move at all. Lord Tywin, who was not near enough to feel the heat of the boy's breath, sighed a sigh that reorganized the air without using sound. "Your Grace," Marjorie said very sweetly, lifting her lashes as if they were heavy. "Some sins are better washed than amputated. If this man's tongue swore too much, let the septon rinse it with holy water and honey both." She laughed a little. Only laughter can polish a blade to reflect your own face back at you, and the court laughed with her because they loved her and because a girl like that must be right or the world would have to admit it was made the wrong way up. Joffrey pouted. He could be turned aside as a stream can be turned into a new channel if you build your stones carefully, but he liked to summon a flood just to see the stones crack. He gestured, peevish, and the man's wrists were untied, the ropes leaving bracelets of red on his skin. The court loosed its breath in one soft body. Ser Meryn's gaze had not left the hall. He had watched the exchange the way a dog watches boys throw a stick he may one day be told to fetch. He lifted a hand to stroke a crease at his throat. His gorget was on, but the strap below it had been tightened too hastily. It pinched. He turned his head to the right to ease it. The small seam where plates overlapped opened like a mouth that had been reluctant to speak. Arya felt the door inside her swing. She did not move yet, only let the idea of the movement test the shape of her bones. There would be two steps, the one that would be seen and the one that would do the work. There would be a sound, Purra whispering behind her that she was going the wrong way, the scrape of a courtier's chair as he turned to see a girl in the wrong place, the small exhale when a thing happens no one has prepared their body to name quickly. There would be blood. She let the possibility of it wet her tongue. If she could taste it now, she could walk through it later. The boy king clapped, bored already. The next petitioner was ushered forward. A woman whose hands were worn from stringing fish. Her voice was frayed from calling across wind. She had a child at her hip whose eyes were too big. The child's gaze swung over the hall and lit on Arya with the solemn curiosity children give to other small people. Then it moved, the way ripples move, and landed on the white shields on the steps. The child's mouth opened not in fear but in that wide, cracked wonder little ones feel for bright things. Ser Meryn saw it and smiled a private smile that made the back of Arya's neck prickle again. She did not allow that to be the reason. She stepped into the aisle between a Lord of the Reach whose hawk's feather tickled her nose and a Selsale whose boots had brought the stink of pitch up the hill. Her cap slipped a fraction. Her tray tilted. One loaf slid and she caught it on her forearm as if this were what she had meant to do all along. She came up the side of the court the way a breeze comes, and where people shifted, they did so for the tray and not for the girl. Thorn lay parallel to her shin, the point under the hem of her skirt. Ser Meryn turned his head again to the right because the strap bit. His jaw flexed. His left foot was half a step out from the others, because he thought he stood like a man in a painting and only paintings stand like that without consequence. His eyes were not on her. His eyes were not on much. It did not matter. Arya had never depended on anyone else's gaze to finish a thing for her. She set the tray on a stand with its legs splayed like a colt's. She took up the loaf that had slid and laid it back like a child to sleep among its companions. She wiped her hands on her apron because hands always wipe, and people expect to see the small gestures that tell them nothing will change. Then she moved and everything did. 2 long steps brought her into the slice of space between shield and stair. She was smaller than the men guarding the king, and she was careful not to be where they had trained their bodies to expect danger. She went where servants go when they clean, where the tips of orators' shoes scuff, where a boy with crossbow eyes never thinks to look. Ser Meryn's hips were above her shoulder. Her breath went out and came back. Her knees bent. Thorn's point kissed the seam beneath the gorget in the quick hollow where the hammer of a heartbeat rises to meet its own sound. The steel wanted to glance. The plates wanted to be the world. Arya's hand made a small correction without thought. Syrio had taught her to trust it. She let the knife know it was part of her the way you tell a frightened animal that it belongs in your lap. She turned her wrist. The point found the opening's darker breath. She drove it home. The first sound was a surprised grunt, no more than any man makes when he stubs his toe on a step he has climbed 100 times. Then the metal scrape, the soft metallic complaint of a buckle Jared, the note a blade makes when it touches a thing it knows it should not be able to touch. Then the wetness, which was a sound too, though people do not often call it by its name. A thickening of the air, A swift, dull patter against leather as warm arterial blood found the top edge of Arya's shoe. His hand shot down too late. It clashed with the steel of his own cuisses, a stupid, human, ordinary movement that would have been funny if it were not the last movement a man makes before his legs forget him. Arya was already shifting away in the same breath that had sent Thorn inside him. The world came all at once. A courtier's gasp broke with the pitch of a boy's voice cracking. The child at the fisherman's hip began to laugh because he thought a game had begun. A Kingsguard to Ser Meryn's left turned slowly, too slowly, because he was disciplined in a way that required permission to be shocked. Cersei's voice sharpened as if someone had pulled a string inside her throat. The king half rose, half sat, not understanding that you cannot do both and look like anything but a boy. Blood came out around the blade as if a tide had been hiding inside him, waiting only to learn a new shore. Arya let go of Thorn because Bone wanted to keep it, and if Bone kept it she would be caught. The smallest part of not being caught is not being held by what you have made, and put her body into the first step of leaving. She walked. Running draws the eye. Passing as if nothing had happened makes the eye believe that nothing has. She had learned this with a stolen crust of bread when she had been smaller and hungrier. Her steps were brisk because those with jugs and tidying to do are always brisk. Her head was down because shame is part of a maid's uniform. The space in the hall that a moment ago had been the shape of Ser Meryn's certainty was now the shape of his absence. It pulled air the way a door sucks at a corridor when it opens to the sea. You could hide a girl in that. Behind her, the first important sound came. Not the king's cry or a lady's scream, but the clatter of a white shield dropped on stone. The Kingsguard to Ser Meryn's left did not mean to drop it. His hand forgot what it was doing when it felt the warmth of the other man's blood splash onto his knuckles. The shield fell toward the stair's edge, struck, spun, and rang out with a note high enough to make even the fat in the torches quiver. That was the sound that turned the hall into a single animal of attention. Arya reached the tray stand. The loaf she had righted slid again, as if it understood that nothing wished to stay in its place today. She let it go. Someone shouted her name. Not her name. Girl. Because she had known the red keep once in another life. She had known it beneath its skin. The passageways that Maegor had made to fight the shadows he feared were not all gone. Some such labyrinths cannot be destroyed without knocking down the thing they were made to haunt. She had found one mouth of them 2 nights ago behind a hanging that showed a hunt for a boar that had never existed. The mouth had a stone that pressed if you pressed another stone 3 feet to the right and 4 feet down, and it let the wall pivot slow as a yawn. She was at that tapestry now, with men turning and the king beginning to find the sound for what had happened, and the queen regent's voice beginning to turn commands into a braid that would bind any loose ends. She slid her fingers under the edge of the hanging and found the cool stone with the scar on it where some desperate boy 2 generations ago had cut it with a knife to make it remember. She pressed with 3 fingers hard enough to whiten her knuckles. The wall moved with the reluctance of a sleepy old dog. A hand landed on her shoulder. She did not think. Thinking would come later when she could afford it. She fell forward into the space the wall was opening, turned her shoulder, and let the hand's grasp slide off as if she were fish and it were water. The man who had grabbed her, not a Kingsguard, praise whatever gods are yet not hateful, but a squire who understood that something must be done by someone even if he did not know which something, stumbled and swore as the tapestry swung back into his face. Arya made herself smaller than she had ever been, pulled the wall just enough to admit a child's breath, and then let it fall shut, the weight of stone closing like a held note. Dark, then. The kind of dark that might have had a shape once but had long ago spent itself and become ordinary. A smell of old lime, rat droppings, the faint sweet stink of a leak somewhere that had found a resting place. She bent and stood still and counted 3 breaths slowly, because a body that has just moved needs a new rhythm, and if you do not give it one, it will choose one that will make you foolish. Then she began to move along the passage with her hand on the left-hand wall, and the memory of the twist of it laid out in her mind like a map drawn by someone who preferred curves to straight lines. Outside, the hall was learning what had happened the way a field learns of the rain by the sound of it on the eaves. The shouting had begun in earnest. Cersei's voice plucked at men like strings. Tywin's voice was a low thing that made other voices stop moving for long enough to hear how low it could be. Joffrey's voice rose and cracked. It would be a sad thing to laugh at later, when men were not busy counting. "Find her," it said, and then, as if the command were a toy he had learned the name of and could not stop saying, "Find her, find her, find her." Arya smiled in the dark without making a shape of her mouth. It was not joy. Joy is a sunlight thing, a room with an open shutter. This was the satisfying click of a thing that has fitted into the place it was meant for, even if the shelf it sits on is crooked and the house built wrong. Ser Meryn Trant was dying in a room full of people who had watched him be a man for a king. He had died in the open. More than that, he had died not in a bed with a whore to hold his hand, and not in some nameless alley where the gutter would drink him and make him a story the next day for boys to pretend bravery with. He had died where girls could see. "Let there be one whose mouth is smaller because he is gone," she thought. "Let there be one who pinches her lips and says there is less hurt in the world today, and may the gods not punish me for knowing it." The passage sloped down and then up. Her shoulder brushed rough stone. She slipped sideways to avoid the protruding corners whose story she had learned with her skin 2 nights ago. The wall on her right began to cool as if air were passing beyond it. She could taste brine. It would let her out by a guardroom that had not been used since before the last king's hand had fallen in a place that had no railings. That guardroom had a door whose hinge very much wished for oil and whose bar had a habit of sticking. She had pinched her finger in it when she tested it the first time and had sworn under her breath in a language the Riverlands had taught her and had licked the blood off because it was her own. She reached it now by the way the stone on either side grew narrow and the ceiling dropped to a height that pressed at the cap on her hair. She felt along the wood in the dark, counting the splinters she had already memorized, found the bar, lifted with a patience that would have seemed unnatural in a girl who had just killed a man if anyone had been there to see her. It stuck, as it enjoyed doing, and then it moved with a soft sucking sound like bread releasing from a pan. The door itself opened as slowly as pride and let her out into a space that smelled of old soldier and damp wool. There was a shelf. There were pegs with nothing on them. There was dust holding the shape of a boot that had not been there for years. Arya stood very still and listened. Noise above, and answering clamor outside. The red keep roared like a lion that had been told it was a cat and had just remembered what size its teeth were. She could not go up. She could not go out into the yard. She would not go back the way she had come, because even stone can learn if you teach it with enough death. Left, then, the guardroom's other door. Smaller, meaner, as if ashamed of itself, opened onto a narrow lane that sloped toward the older parts of the keep, the places with low roofs that had not been repainted since Robert's first year. She had found that door as well, because care is a thing you put in your pocket and never stop needing. It squealed like a child when she opened it. She let it squeal. There was too much else for any man with ears to listen to now. The lane was empty. The sky had gone to the color of pewter. The afternoon had been knocked sideways by the commotion and was trying to stand up again. She kept to the wall under the drip of a gutter that had always been lazy. Her shoes left faint half-moons on the grit where Ser Meryn's blood had tried to dry. She turned right where a barrel had been left to bless the corner with staves releasing their hoops. Left where a cat had made its bed in the old straw by a henhouse that had not seen hens since Aries. Cats do not forget girls who move softly. The cat raised its head and regarded her with a blink that was almost approval. She inclined her head back. Courtesy costs nothing and returns itself with interest. Down from these low courts, the keep fell toward the king's gate like a man admitting something he had been denying. Out beyond the gate, the city went on being itself. A tangle of lives that had never once touched a white cloak except to get out of its way. The clamor from the throne room reached the streets in changed form. Shouts, questions, sudden laughter that was not laughter but the breaking of tension. The rumor was already running ahead to open doors for itself with lies. In 5 minutes she would be a man. In 10 she would be a sellsword from Tyrosh with blue hair. By nightfall she would be an assassin out of a story with eyes that saw through walls and a cloak that made her mist. She would let them have that. At the low arch where the keep's servants used to slip out to buy bread with their own coppers, a pair of gold cloaks had taken their ease earlier to roll dice. Arya had noted them when she had come to test the hinge of the small door in the guardroom wall. One had been a plump man with ears like pinched dumplings, the other a lean boy with spots and a way of scratching his chin when he thought. They were not there now. They were in the hall or on the steps or in the yard, shouting orders none would heed because command is a habit, and no one had taught these men to obey their betters with their bodies when their bodies did not wish to. She slipped through the arch, crossed the patch of ground that some old hand had once called a garden because something green had been persuaded to grow there between two stones, and found the servants' path that led down against the cliff to the kitchens. It was a zigzag. It would let her feel the city's breath before she had to breathe it herself. The path was in shadow now. Shadows like that hide everything that wants to be hid except for the eyes that refuse to stop seeing. She let herself move faster. She did not run. She went with the path's own speed and let it take her like water. At the bottom, the kitchen yard burst worried voices like a stew that has boiled too hard. The cook shouted names. The understeward shouted numbers. Someone swore that the wine went missing in all this confusion when everyone knew who drank it. Arya moved among them as one of them. She took up a basket of onion skins and carried it to the midden. She emptied it and watched the skins take the shape of another day's labor. She went back and took up a broom and pushed sweepings toward a threshold that needed them gone. If anyone asked her a question, she would answer with a word that said everything and nothing together. If anyone looked at her for longer than eyes need to see a girl, she would blink slow and be dull. No one did. Panic does to the eye what too much light does. It makes things glare until you have to look away or be blinded. In that glare, maids vanish. Even the cleverest of queens forget what shape their servants' backs took when they bent to their work. The kitchen corridor led to a narrow door that opened on the slope behind the castle, the one that rolled down like a rumpled coverlet toward the outer wall. The door's key hung on a string with 6 others, and the girl who watched them had hair the color of barley and eyes the color of a sky that is about to change. Her name was Gret. Arya had watched her watch keys. She had seen when Gret scratched her ankle and when she cast her eyes at the yard for the boy who had not come and when she sighed as if a small house inside her were leaking. Arya had asked her once about the smell of rosemary on her fingers and had listened to the story about a mother in Maidenpool without saying that she had been there once and that it smelled of fish. Now Gret was not watching keys. She was listening to the shouting up the hill the way a girl listens for her father's step when she knows he has been drinking. Arya took the keys, found the 3rd from the left, slipped it into the lock, and opened the door to a wedge of air that smelled of dust, crushed time, and the sea. She went through. She did not look back to see if Gret noticed. Not looking back is a skill that requires practice. If you do not look back, the world has to do you the courtesy of pretending you have already gone. The door swung shut against the heel of her shoe with a soft thud like a heart that has settled into a new rhythm, and the keyway gave a little burp when the key came out. She hung the keys back where they belonged and left Gret to her listening. The slope down to the outer wall was steep enough to make calves see. Plain if you were not a girl who had walked half the 7 kingdoms on the edge of fear. She descended it in slants to save her knees. The air here held less of court and more of the world. Gulls, tar, the faint green rot of seaweed, a cook fire from a house just out of sight where someone was burning something they ought not. It was nearly dusk. The city took dusk the way an inn takes coin, with eagerness and a calculation that will reveal itself later. Lamps began to wink in windows as if the buildings were practicing winking at pretty girls. The outer gate would be watched. The king's gate would be watched as a hawk watches the field when it is hungry. The mud gate would be watched with the careful malice of men who love to find someone to beat who cannot beat back. But there are ways through any city for those who have not had comfort tied to their feet. To the river, then. She would not go to the docks where the gold cloaks clumped with eyes like spoiled milk. She would go to the smaller landing where fishwives tied their skiffs and green boys went down to spit to see if they could hit the water. She would find a boat with a man in it who had the look of someone who had lost a son once and had learned that helping girls would not bring him back but who did it anyway. She would give him the last of the coins she had braided into her hair when the cap was on, and he would take them and not look at her face, and she would ask for the other side where the alleys were different and the stories even more so, where she would not. The plan always had room to grow a new branch. Plans that do not bend break. As she came down the last of the slope to the angle where the outer wall met the cliff's drop, someone stepped from shadow to stand in her way. She had thorn no longer, and she had left needle with a man whose name had gone out of the world, and she had her hands and her balance and the way the air folds at a person's knees when they think to move to the left. She shifted her weight to the balls of her feet without letting her head tell anyone she was doing it. "Little maid," said the person in a voice dry as good paper. "You have lovely timing. I was just thinking of roses." The woman who spoke was not dressed in the red of one house or the green of another, but in a brown so elegant that it made the color of itself a chess piece you could not take on a board you had not been invited to play. She wore a plain cap. She had the soft, small smile the Reach puts on when it has decided to be dangerous. Her eyes were thorns wearing velvet. The Queen of Thorns stood under the bank of the wall where any common passerby would think she was a servant come to piss. She smelled of dried lavender, of ink, and of something sharper beneath that had no business in an old lady's perfume. Arya felt her muscles let out breath one at a time, the way people do who have been told that a blade at their throat is only a ribbon. It was not only a ribbon, but the hand that held it had not lifted yet. "My lady," Arya said, and kept her eyes lower than the old woman's cap. The titles meant nothing in the dark. They mean less in a country where gods forget to attend to the living. She said it anyway. "I have a great-granddaughter," the old woman said, as if this were the point of a story about wolves and snows and ships, "who thinks the world can be made new with lace and a girl's courage. I do not discourage her, as it is good for the blood to move. But lace tears on thorns, and courage by itself is a kind of meat the world enjoys. Where are you going, little maid?" "Downhill," said Arya, "because a lie and a truth can be the same thing if you hold them the right way." She could feel the old woman measuring the word and finding it exactly what it was. "You must teach me sometime to carry a knife in a loaf of bread," the Queen of Thorns said mildly. "We have gardeners, but all of them think only of the pruning of branches we have already grown. No one ever thinks to pull up a sow thistle when it is small except for the women who bake. They know weeds and bread and men are all the same in one important way. You are bleeding on your shoe." Arya glanced down. A thin arc where thorn had been wet had painted itself over the leather and made a line on her ankle like a bracelet. She had not felt it in the doing. She felt it now with that useless kind of awareness that cannot help because the time for helping has passed. She would have licked it off if she could without being seen, and would have licked her fingers because her body remembered that she was supposed to keep all her blood if she wanted to live out the night. "Tell your rose girl," Arya said, her voice as flat as the stone under her shoe. "That lace is no good against spiders." She did not know why she said it until the words were in the air and belonged to them both. Marjorie's face, with its lifted lashes and its soft, known mouth, had been brave in the hall in a way Arya had not known could be bravery, that could be respected even by wolves. It made the world more complicated and so more true. The old woman's eyes took in the words like a gardener taking cuttings. "She has a deal to learn yet," she said. "I mean to keep her a little longer in a world where girls are not meat. You have made that harder and easier together today. I do not know whether to kiss you or hate you. It is possible to do both. Go on, then, before I think of a way to keep you that cannot be called kindness." Arya did not bow. Bows are promises, and she had made enough for one day. She slipped past the old woman with a small turn of her shoulder that did not permit touch. The old woman's hand did not reach for her. The air did not change, not for that, but it changed for other men calling down from above as if the gatehouse had learned to shout. Arya went into the greenish light that leaks from the sea when the hour grows late and the gulls go home to say their ugly prayers. She found the skiff by the smell first. Tar, fish, wet rope, and the kind of cheap wine that men buy when they have to enough times that they pretend it is for love. The owner of the skiff was a man in a wool cap whose ear had been ripped at the top in some boyhood accident and never sewn. He had a face like the underside of a weathered plank, gray, cracked by salt, more steadfast than anything. He looked up when she stepped onto the stone and did not look surprised at the size of the person making the request. He had eyes that believed information about the world must be taken in the order it arrived. 2 coppers, he said, naming a price that was a test and a kindness both because it said girl and also girl fleeing. He would charge more to a lady for the same distance. He would charge a man in a hurry too much. He would never explain any of this to himself without lying. She slid her hand under her cap and freed 2 coppers from where she had braided them that morning before her hands had known it was morning. She laid them on the plank beside his foot the way a cat lays a mouse, without comment. He put his hand over them, and the boat acknowledged both that it had done so and that it would not comment either. "North Bank," she said very softly. "Anywhere the gold cloaks are not." "There is nowhere the gold cloaks are not today," he said, looking at the walls where the yellow of them clustered like mildew. "But there are places where they are not yet. I can still count that high." He held his hand out without making it a question, and she took it without making it a vow. The boat rocked under her foot with the small satisfaction of wood accepting weight. He pushed off with the long oar, and the boat slid out into the water as if it had been wanting to be part of this all day and had not known what exactly would make it so. On the river, the city was a different creature. Its truth was not in its stones but in its reflections. The copper of the tannery's runoff, the bruised blue of the evening, the small gold of a lantern swaying on a sloop as if it were a firefly trapped under oiled paper. The skiff's bow hissed as it cut. A dog barked on the quay, and then stopped as if a hand had been placed over its mouth. Voices carried, high, angry, frightened, excited, drunk. A rumor darted across the water like a thrown pebble skipping. You could not tell where it had started or where it would sink. The man in the cap did not speak. She did not either. Halfway across, she allowed herself to breathe out some of the breath she had been carrying in a place under her ribs. It did not go far. Breath like that has to be taken to a quiet room and given a chair and a drink. She had not got a quiet room. She had a city that would learn and a list with one fewer name and a long line of possibilities that were not all escape. She thought of Sansa. She had not looked for her in the hall because looking would have made her not see. She saw her now the way light makes pictures on the inside of your lids when you close your eyes. Sansa's mouth was as she had left it, only rounder with more swallowing. She would be told of Ser Meryn's death with words that would try to shape her face, because that is what kings do to girls. They tell them how to arrange their features so that they fit the furniture. Sansa would not cry where men could see her. Sansa would look ahead at the floor and make her hand lie very still on the banister and do nothing that could be called anything. It was a kind of courage. It hurt to respect it. The man brought the skiff in on the shadowed side of a pier where barnacles had written their own history, and the city did not look so much as if it had been built as it had grown. He reached for the post with one hand and caught it and stopped the boat's motion with the small skill that separates a man from a corpse. He turned his head to look at her. There was the least suggestion of a question in it. "And now?" "Up," Arya said, because the word could be used for both an instruction and a direction. "Up, away from the river. If they look down, they will see. If they look up, they will pass me by." He nodded as if he had known she would say that. She stepped onto the pier, found the plank that was beginning to rot and stepped over it, found the ladder that had one rung missing and put her foot where there was none without falling. She did not look back. Something inside her wanted to look back because men wanted to know whether women saw them even when they had asked not to be seen. She would not give him that. He would handle his kindness without being repaid in gaze. On the north bank, the alleys were close as whispers. She slid into them with her head bent and her cap low and her feet finding the places where cobbles had been rubbed smooth by centuries of lives in shoes that did not fit. She passed a baker who had a daughter with hair like hers and a man who sold onions who would be dead in a year of a cough, though he did not know it yet, though he had begun to dream of bile. She passed a doorway where a cat had had her litter and 2 boys crouched in awe as if they had discovered dragons. She passed a shrine to the mother where someone had set an orange, and she did not take it because there are some offerings you do not borrow even when you are hungry. She went up until the wind off the sea was a memory and the smells were of meat and dung and pepper and prostitutes' cheap rosewater. She slipped between a tavern and the house that had grown against its side like a child clinging to a mother's skirt, and came out into a court where the paving had been laid in a pattern that made no sense because the man who laid it had been drunk. She crossed it and tapped a rhythm on a shutter with her knuckles because some habits become plans because they are good habits. The shutter opened a crack. A girl's eye looked out, quick as a sparrow. "You're late," the eye said. then became a face that had trained itself to be older than it was. "But not as late as you will be if you keep looking behind you." "I don't keep," Arya said. It was not a pun in her mouth. It was a statement of practice. The girl at the shutter snorted and the shutter shut. The door opened. A smell of beer so old it had become furniture came out as if it had been trapped and begged release. Arya stepped in. The tavern's common room was empty except for a man asleep with his head on his arm at a table near the hearth and a woman taking a pot off the hook to see if it had begun to burn. The woman had strong arms. One of them was a little smaller than the other where a child had eaten too much of it. She looked Arya up and down as if she were a piece of wood and the woman were building a door. "You bring knives to my house, little maid?" she asked without heat. "I return with none," Arya said, which was a way of apologizing that did not use the word for fear of teaching it to grow in the wrong place. The woman's mouth made no expression at all. That too was a kind of kindness. She set the pot back over the fire, gave it a stir, and said, "You can have stew if you can eat without being noticed." "I have practice," said Arya, and then, because something inside her had been waiting to say it since she had started walking under banners that covered suns, she added, "There's a man dead up there who killed a friend of mine who danced with swords." "Good," said the woman with the strong arms. Not because she liked death, but because she knew the difference between a wolf taking a lamb and a girl taking back a breath. "Sit there. Don't drip on my floor." Arya sat. The chair was a thing that welcomed backs that had not had a welcome all day. The stew was thin. Most days, but warm. It took the place inside her that had outlived names and lined it with something like patience. Her hands shook a little when she lifted the spoon and then did not. The girl with the sparrow eyes brought her a crust. She ate it slowly because Syrio would have mocked her for gulping and because she had time, now that the loudest of it was done. The common room's shadows lengthened into shapes that were not men. The sleeping man stirred and smacked his lips and did not wake. Outside, the city went on making stories about what had happened in a room with a throne and the sour copper of blood on white enamel. She finished. She wiped the spoon with a scrap of bread because there is no reason to give the gods more than they already took, and stood. The woman with the strong arms nodded once and then did something unexpected that was also the most ordinary thing in the world. She reached out and tucked a stray hair behind Arya's ear the way a mother does when she is not thinking about pretending not to be one. It made Arya want to bite something. It made her eyes feel raw. She left before either urge learned a name. Night had come. Lamps marked the lanes like teeth. The voices that had shouted had settled into a lower note that means men are drinking about the thing and making themselves heroes of it. The gold cloaks hunted in clumps. Sometimes they hunted alone because a man had a notion about glory. Sometimes the Kingsguard's white cloaks stooped together like swans and made their white a lie. The Queen Regent would not sleep. The Hand would not either. The new queen had beeswax on her hands from too much candlelight. The Queen of Thorns had roses that did not know whether to open or close in this weather. On a pale dais under a painted ceiling, a boy dreamed of crowns that turned to nettles when he reached for them. Arya kept moving until the city's clamor became its usual lullaby. She reached a house whose door had once been green and knocked the way you knock when you know knocking is a sin and a necessity. A man with a blind eye opened it. He smelled of onions. He had a kindness in him that had been burnt on one side by life's accident. He looked at her and saw that she was not a beggar and not a thief and not a girl who had come to sell herself, and all those knots added up to a thing he could hold. "Upstairs," he said. "Third on the left. The bed has swallowed worse." She went up. The stairs made a small complaint under her feet. The room had a bed that had a memory of men in it, and a window that opened onto a piece of sky the color of old tin. She closed the door, sat on the bed, and let herself lie down without taking off her shoes. She did not sleep at once, not because she was afraid and not because she was unafraid, but because there was a sound she had to hear first. The moment when the day, which had been stretched like a drum, slackened, and the skin of it gave a little and the air could move again. She heard it. It was the softest sound the world makes. She put her hand under her cap and took out the last copper and put it under her tongue because once she had been taught to keep a coin there and live, and you should never cast away a lesson that saved you. She closed her eyes and kept watch over herself from the inside until sleep came like a cat deciding a lap is safe. In the morning, men would be hanged. In the morning, a proclamation would be nailed to doors with more nails than necessary to make fear the hammer's other hand. In the morning, a girl with barley hair would notice that the keys had moved and think of her mother and say nothing. In the morning, the Queen Regent would look at her son with that expression mothers get when they have done a terrible job for too long and do not know how to stop and will teach themselves that this is love. In the morning, Tywin Lannister would inquire how it was that a Kingsguard died in a hall full of people and no one could say what the girl had looked like. In the morning, the Queen of Thorns would say to a granddaughter that the world is as pricked as they are and lace must beware. In the morning, Arya would wake and be the same in the ways that mattered and different in a place that would never be seen. She would make tea in a cracked cup and eat a heel of bread and put her cap on again and go out into a city that had more eyes than any man owned, and she would watch a street like a swordsman watches the weight of air. Somewhere a cat would remember her and rub its cheek against a doorway as if it had been kissed. Somewhere a man would tell a story about a small assassin with hair like black iron and eyes like coal. Somewhere a child would say, no, it was a ghost. Somewhere a woman would look at her hands and decide they were less empty. She lay with her eyes closed and her hands on her belly as if it contained a river. She could feel Syrio in the spaces behind her elbows, in the memory of her left foot's careful stamp, in the way she had turned her wrist to meet a seam that had wanted to be permanent. He had not been dead when she left him, but he had been the kind of man who could die because of another man and still be something. She said his name inside herself and let it sit there as if it were a stone to hold a paper down so the wind would not take it. She did not think of the hound. That would come in its season. She did not think of Joffrey, because a boy who will die soon deserves no more of a girl's breath than a cracked cup deserves to be made into an heirloom. She did not think of Cersei yet because the world gives you that kind of thinking whether you make a place for it or not. She thought briefly, without setting a table for it, of a room in Winterfell where a fire burned long and slow and made the stones smell old and safe, and of a father who had put his hand on her head and said, "That's my girl," without asking her to be different. The thought did not cut her as it had in the months when every good memory had teeth. It went past her like a small boat on a wide river, heading toward a bend she did not need to see around. She slept then. She slept the way the tired sleep in cities, with one ear listening to boots and one hand halfway to where a knife would be if she owned one. The house breathed around her with the long, slow sighs of old wood. The city turned over and showed its other side to the moon. The red keeps stones cooled and set like bread that has found its pan and will not slump. Above the throne, in the painting of the seven that hung askew, a bit of gilt flaked and fell into a seam where it would be found in 100 years by a boy who would sell it to a man who would tell a woman that it was more than it was. When she woke, the light was a dirty one that did not promise anything. The blind-eyed man's wife had left a cup outside the door. There was a slice of pear in the bottom of it. It had browned at the edges but was still sweet. Arya drank the water and ate the pear and slid her cap into her pocket and let her hair lie down along her head like a docile animal. She came down the steps without making them complain. She put a copper on the table, though the blind-eyed man had not asked for it and had not made a ledger of her debt. He lifted his chin and nodded at the air and said, "May your feet go where they are wanted," which was more of a blessing than most prayers make when they are told to work for a living. Outside, the day had news. Men told one another about arrests as if they had been the ones to bind wrists. The gold cloaks had shaken taverns awake in search of a ghost, and Kingsguard had ridden down a boy on a donkey because he looked like another boy who had once lied to a king. The baker at the corner had been pulled into the street because his oven was warm at the wrong hour. There were whispers that the new queen had held the king's hand and that he had not pulled away. There were whispers that the old queen had not slept and had scratched herself until her arms were freckled with red. There were whispers that the hand had been patient and terrible, and that a squire had been found with blood on his fingers and nothing to say about it. There were whispers that the gods had been seen in the hall, and that they had worn a maid's cap. Arya walked with her head down and let the stories have their day. She turned where alleys turned and let the city's logic be her own. Not the logic of kings or proclamations or even wine, but the logic of mouths and hands and where they must go to become part of the next hour. In a market, she stole an apple by setting it carefully on top of 3 others and then rearranging them so that when the stall owner swore and chased a boy who had snatched at a coin, he did not see that he had lost what he could afford to lose. She ate the apple and gave the core to a dog that had honest eyes. She went to a fountain and washed the line of dried blood from her ankle and the stain from her shoe until what remained looked like something else. In the afternoon, she went back up the hill, not to the castle but to a place where she could see its profile against the hard blue of the sky. She sat on a low wall that had been warmed by the sun and swung her feet like a child who has been told to wait. From here, the Red Keep did not look like a mouth or a beast or a temple. It looked like a thing men had made because they were afraid and had been persuading themselves ever since that the making had solved the fear. It was a set of walls. It was a problem of stone. It was a place where a man had died because a seam had been left where a seam should not be. A girl sat beside her on the wall. No one she knew, just a child with a dirty nose and a gap where a tooth had been. The girl did not look at Arya. She looked at the keep with the expression small people wear when they wonder if large things are real. "They say a girl killed one of the white men," the child said in the tone of an announcer in a market who has goods of no value and an absolute belief in them. "They say she had wings. They say she turned into a rat after and ran into a hole. They say many things," Arya said, and took a bite of bread she had bought with the last of her coppers because sometimes food you pay for sits better. The child swung her legs in time with Arya's, as if she had found a song in the movement. "Can girls be that?" the child asked, her voice suddenly very small in the windy space under the sky. "If they have to," Arya said. "If the world makes them. If no one teaches the boys how not to make girls be that. Then yes." The child considered this and then nodded as if some private count had come out even. She slid off the wall with the careful balance of a street-bred creature and ran toward a man who might have been her father or might only have been the next hour. Arya watched her go. She touched the cap in her pocket and then put it back on her head because there was no reason to stop being invisible while you were thinking of being seen. She felt for the first time then, not relief, not triumph. Those are songs men sing about other men. She felt the quiet that comes when a wheel has taken a hill and the horse can hear the rest of the road and does not mind. There were still names. There were still rooms and cords and men with dry mouths and teeth too white. There would be losses because the world takes its due and then asks you to thank it for being reasonable. There would be hunger. There might be mercy. She would not count on it. She slid down from the wall and stood. The keep's banners snapped. Somewhere a queen tried to decide how to wear fear without making it look like fear. Somewhere a hand signed a piece of paper that would make grief tidy. Somewhere a septon chose a sermon about obedience and found he could not make his mouth say it. Somewhere, under heavy stone, blood darkened and turned sticky and then turned old, and a boy in a white cloak cleaned it with a disgust he would tell himself was about the blood and not about the man. Arya pulled her cap low. She took a breath that was not sharpened by duty. She started walking toward the kind of dusk in which girls become street and stone and sky, not to vanish but to bide. The city made room for her without understanding it was doing so. That was all right. The best rooms are the ones you make yourself when there is no furniture. Her steps carried her into the smell of onions and piss and the sweeter, older scent of wood smoke. She tasted salt on her lip, though there was no sea in the air. It had come up with her along her veins. She did not wipe it away. She kept it the way you keep the sound of a teacher calling your name, to see if you can learn how to answer it differently the next time. Sirio's voice spoke out of the place in her where a sword waits to be a finger. "First you see," it said again, "the old lesson made new by having worked. Then you move. Last you are gone." She looked. She moved. She let the city lose her the way a great beast loses a flea it does not know has bitten it. She went to ground. She rose again. She wrote her shape in a place in the air and then erased it with the back of her hand. And in the Red Keep, on a dais where boys have tried and kings have failed, the open remained. A bright wound in the day that had closed around it and could not pretend that nothing had happened in its heart. The city learned to live with it because cities are good at that. The names left on a girl's tongue tasted less like iron and more like bread. Only a little. Enough to keep walking. Enough to want the next seam, the next moment, The next time when a room crowded with witnesses will not be enough to save a man from what he made of himself. Enough for now.